They called him untouchable, a raging Mustang, black as a starless midnight, who had broken more than just bones. He'd shattered pride. He'd left dozens of seasoned cowboys bleeding in the Wyoming dirt. They called him Blackstorm. So when a wealthy ranch baron named Clint Morrison staked $2 million that no man alive could so much as lay a hand on the beast, the crowd roared. They laughed and they cheered because they knew deep in their bones that he was right. But then, out of the dust and the jeers, a figure stepped forward, a man no one expected. A poor, limping veteran with nothing but worn boots, a scarred past, and a gaze as steady as the mountains. What happened next would silence the laughter. It would shake an empire built on arrogance to its very foundation. And it would prove that the fiercest battles aren't won with ropes or whips, but with something far, far harder to break. The town of Red Valley was the kind of place you drove through on your way to somewhere else. A single main street, a handful of weathered storefronts, and a whole lot of dust. Beyond that, nothing but sagebrush until the sky fell down to meet the hills. Life here was quiet, predictable. You worked cattle, you drank hard on Saturday, you prayed harder on Sunday. But this week, Red Valley was anything but quiet. The rumor had caught fire. $2 million. Cash on the barrel, all for touching a horse they called a demon. The news drew them in from every corner of the state. Cowboys in beat-up pickups, rodeo champs with silver buckles and easy smiles. Gamblers from as far as Reno, sniffing the air for a long shot. By midday, the town square was a powder keg of sweat, hope, and greed. Food vendors hawked roasted corn, kids begged to see the wild horse, but under the carnival noise was a different sound. A hum of dread, because these folks hadn't come to see a miracle. They'd come to see a disaster. They'd come to watch a man get broken. At the center of it all stood Clint Morrison, a man who owned half the state and acted like he owned the sun, too. He was silver-haired, barrel-chested, and dressed in a white Stetson that gleamed like polished bone. His boots were crocodile leather. His cigars cost more than most men's weekly wages. He stood on a platform overlooking a brand-new arena, a wooden circle he'd had built in less than a week. It was a cage for a monster. His voice crackled over a microphone, sharp and smug. $2 million, he boomed, drawing out the words, for any man brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk into that ring and touch Blackstorm. A roar went up, part thrill, part bloodlust. Morrison let a plume of smoke drift toward the sky. His grin was a predator's. But mark my words, he added, his voice dropping, not one soul will leave that ring without leaving a little blood in the dirt. Not one. The crowd stomped and cheered. It was a prize fight where one of the fighters was death itself. And then the gates opened. Blackstorm exploded into the arena like a thunderclap given flesh. He was massive, nearly 18 hands high, his body a roadmap of muscle under a coat so black it seemed to drink the daylight. A ragged scar ran down his left shoulder, an old piece of some forgotten war. He hit the ground and the earth shook. He screamed. A high, furious sound that rattled teeth and froze the blood. He hammered his hooves against the dirt, again and again, the sound of war drums promising a slaughter. Men who'd been laughing seconds before were silent now. They'd all heard the stories. Blackstorm wasn't just a horse, he was a career ender. He'd put more than 30 men in the hospital. A rodeo champion swore he could last 10 seconds on his back. He lasted 4 before a shattered collarbone sent him to the ground. Another man tried to rope him out in the canyons. They found him the next day, dragged for half a mile, alive by sheer dumb luck. Morrison had kept the beast locked away for years, feeding him just enough to keep him mean. Now he'd brought him out like a gladiator, a spectacle to prove his own power. To prove that his money could make even a demon dance to his tune. The first challenger was a kid, barely 20, full of rodeo swagger. He twirled his rope, walked into the ring with a cocky grin, and lasted all of 3 seconds. Blackstorm lunged, reared up, and lashed out. The kid went flying, landing with a sickening thud that echoed across the silent arena. He didn't get up. Medics rushed in, and the crowd erupted in a savage mix of horror and delight. The second man was older, a veteran rider with a face like tanned leather. He tried to be smart, circling the horse, talking low. For a moment it looked like it might work. Then the Mustang screamed, charged, and smashed the man against the wooden railing so hard the planks splintered. He went down, clutching an arm bent at an angle it was never meant to hold. The third contender was tough as rawhide. He believed in patience. He walked in slow, hand outstretched, whispering nonsense. He never even got close. Blackstorm spun with terrifying speed, a blur of black fury, and a single kick caught the man in the ribs. He dropped like a sack of grain, out cold before he hit the dirt. Ambulance sirens became the soundtrack of the afternoon. With each broken man, the crowd's hunger grew. The air grew thick with the smell of churned earth, sweat, and blood. And through it all, Clint Morrison stood on his platform, grinning like a Roman emperor, watching the lions do their work. "You see," he shouted into the microphone, spreading his arms wide, "this is Blackstorm, the mightiest beast in the West. I told you no man could touch him. There isn't a soul here with the guts to even try." The crowd roared, a mix of awe and anger. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about one man's bottomless arrogance. Morrison looked down at them all, a king on his throne, sure of his victory. But he was wrong, because in that crowd there were eyes that saw something else. Not just a monster, not just a spectacle. They saw a prisoner. And the man watching was the only one in the whole damn town who knew what that felt like. He sat on the far edge of the grandstand, where the paint was peeling and the dust settled thick. A lean man in a frayed canvas jacket, his face etched with lines the sun and hard times had carved there. When he stood, he did it carefully, favoring his left leg with a slight, unnatural hitch. A few locals nudged each other. "Ain't that Carter?" One of them snickered. "The crippled vet, lives in that shack up on Bitter Creek." "Yeah," another added, not bothering to lower his voice. "Cuts firewood for gas money, that's about it." Elias Carter heard them. He always heard them. Their words were just wind. His eyes, a weathered grey, were locked on the creature in the ring. He didn't see a demon. He saw the way the horse's ears flicked back, not just with rage, but with fear. The crowd saw a monster. Elias saw a storm trapped in a cage, desperately looking for a way out. He stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He just started down the steps, one measured stride after another, the heel of his bad leg making a soft, rhythmic thud. Laughter followed him like a pack of dogs. "You gotta be kidding me," a man with a big silver buckle bellowed. "He can't even walk straight, and he's gonna take on that devil." Catcalls and whistles rained down. Someone threw a peanut shell. Elias kept walking. He reached the wooden rail, scarred by decades of boots and spurs, and laid his palm flat against it. He took a single deep breath, and the roar of the crowd seemed to fade away. Up on his platform, Clint Morrison's voice boomed again. "Well, well, Mr. Carter, is it? I've heard of you. The one-legged Marine with a cabin full of ghosts." The crowd howled with laughter. "Tell me, Carter," Morrison sneered, "what makes you think you can succeed where 30 good men have failed?" Elias lifted his head, his grey eyes meeting the rancher's. He didn't say a word. But something in that steady, unbroken gaze made Morrison's smile falter for just a second. The rancher recovered quickly. "All right then," he shouted, spreading his hands. "We're generous here in Red Valley. Let's make this interesting. Survive 10 seconds in that ring with Blackstorm Carter and the 2 million is yours." A buzz of disbelief ran through the stands. 10 seconds. It sounded like a death sentence. Elias nodded once, a small, sharp movement. Then he ducked under the rail as the sheriff unlatched the gate. The world went quiet as he stepped onto the churned dirt. He carried nothing. No rope, no whip, no helmet. He just walked toward the center of the ring, his limp more pronounced on the soft ground. He stopped in the middle, where the hoofprints crisscrossed like a map to nowhere. He lifted his face to the horse. Blackstorm turned, his entire body coiling like a spring. He reared high, hooves slashing the air, and came down with a crash that felt like a rifle shot. His scream tore the dust from the rafters. Then he charged, 1,000 pounds of muscle and fury eating up the ground between them. Elias did not run. He shifted his weight, setting his good foot like an anchor. His hands hung open at his sides. The grandstand shrieked. A woman covered her eyes. A man bellowed, "He's dead!" The ground trembled. The horse was a black freight train bearing down on him. Elias could feel the hot breath, see the red fire in its eyes. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the horse stopped. He skidded to a halt just feet away, all four hooves digging into the dirt, sending a fountain of dust into the air. His head was high, the whites of his eyes showing. He wheeled, stamping and snorting, his neck corded with veins. The echo of what he had almost done hung in the air. Silence fell like a shroud. The screams died in 1,000 throats. Elias didn't move. He let the moment settle. He let the fact that the animal had chosen not to kill him become the new truth. Slowly, he lifted his right hand, palm open, fingers loose. It wasn't a command. It was an offer. He kept his shoulders low, his posture soft. He was not a threat. He was just a man. Blackstorm snorted, a wet, explosive sound. He tossed his head and took a half step back. His ears flickered, catching sounds no one else could hear. "He's listening," a small boy whispered from the stands. Sammy Miller, freckled and fierce, his knuckles white on the back of the bench in front of him. "He's listening to him." Elias breathed, in through the nose, slow, out through the mouth, slower. He let the rhythm of his breath become a rope of air between them. It was the same rhythm he used on nights when the explosions still lit up the dark behind his eyes. He kept his hand up, not reaching, just waiting. For a long moment, the man and the Mustang stood in a world of their own, surrounded by 1,000 pairs of eyes. A fly buzzed lazily between them. A camera shutter clicked, freezing a moment the town would argue about for decades. Elias finally lowered his hand. The horse's ears twitched. He raised it again, just an inch. Blackstorm's breathing evened out. He took another half step, this time sideways, pawing once at the dirt. "Easy," Elias said, the words so quiet they were almost a thought. "Easy, big fella." He didn't say, "I know what a cage feels like." He didn't say, "They put me in one too." He just stood there, offering something Blackstorm had never been given. Trust. "What is this?" Morrison's voice cracked through the silence, brittle with anger. "A parlor trick. The animal's just tired, that's all." But no one was listening to Morrison. They were watching something delicate and strange unfold, something that mockery would shatter. Elias finally let his arm drop. He took one step back, then another, never turning his back, never giving the horse the insult of showing fear. Blackstorm blew hard through his nose, shook his massive head, and held his ground. The moment was over. Elias reached the gate and stepped through. The latch clanged shut behind him like the closing of a book. Morrison was on his feet, his face flushed. "A coincidence," he barked into the microphone. "The beast was winded. Anyone can get lucky once." Some people shouted their agreement, desperate for the world to make sense again, but others just stared. They'd seen a man walk into a whirlwind and come out without a scratch. They'd seen an executioner spare a life for no reason they could name. Elias didn't argue. He didn't even look at Morrison. He just let his gaze sweep over the arena, over the patches of dirt darkened by blood. "Get him out of here," Morrison snapped at the sheriff. "The show's over for today. We'll see if his luck holds out tomorrow." Sheriff Walker didn't move. He just watched Elias walk away, his limp heavier now that the adrenaline was gone. The sheriff knew a battlefield when he saw one, and he'd just watched two of them meet in a ring of dust. As Elias walked toward the exit, the crowd parted for him. Their insults and their certainty had vanished. A young boy, Sammy, leaned over the rail. "Mr. Carter," he called out, his voice cracking with awe. "He heard you. He really heard you." Elias paused and glanced up. He gave the boy a small, real nod. Then he lowered his eyes and kept walking. Behind him, the whispers started. The arguments, the theories. Why had the monster stopped? Why had he spared the one man who offered him nothing but space to breathe? That night, the Iron Spur Saloon was buzzing like a kicked beehive. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of spilled beer, and every man had an opinion. Luck, that's all it was. One ranch hand slurred, slamming his mug on the table. The horse was tired. Any fool could have done what Carter did. Another spat into the sawdust. "They're calling him a hero for nearly getting himself killed. He's just a broken-down old fool." The laughter was loud and cruel. A few men started mimicking Elias's limp, staggering around the room to the delight of the crowd. But not everyone was laughing. At the edges of the room, a few old-timers sat quiet, staring into their drinks. They'd seen something that day that didn't sit right with easy mockery. Then the saloon doors swung open and Elias Carter stepped inside. The room went quiet for a beat. He wore the same faded jacket, the same worn jeans. He moved with the same hitch in his step. He ignored the stairs and took a small table in the corner, ordering a black coffee. "Coffee?" someone jeered. "Thinks he's a damn preacher now." "Nah," another man smirked. "He's the horse whisperer. Gonna sell tickets to watch him stare at animals." The laughter started up again, sharp and ugly. Elias just cradled his mug, the steam rising to hide his face. He looked like a man who'd carried the weight of the world for so long he'd forgotten how to set it down. The taunts grew bolder. Then a heavy palm slapped a tabletop, and the sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot. Enough. Every head turned. Standing in the middle of the room was Jack Reynolds. A man built like a boulder, with arms corded from a life of hard ranch work and a burn scar that snaked up his forearm. His eyes were like chips of flint. "You sit here," he said, his voice hard as iron, "and you laugh at a man who bled for this country while you were all safe at home." The laughter died. "You think you know Carter?" Jack's gaze swept the room. "You know the limp. You know the cabin. You don't know Fallujah." The name dropped into the silence like a stone. 2004, Jack began, his voice low and raw. "The bloodiest fight our unit ever saw. Streets choked with fire, RPGs coming through the damn windows. Carter caught a chunk of shrapnel in his leg. Should have been the end of him. But he didn't stop. He crawled through smoke and broken glass and dragged two of us out. Me and a kid named Dawson." Jack's jaw tightened. Dawson didn't make it. But Carter tried. The room was dead silent. Men who'd been laughing minutes ago were now staring at their hands, ashamed. "You want to know why he didn't flinch when that horse charged him?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner. "Because he's already looked death in the eye and told it to go to hell. A horse doesn't scare him. Not after that." He jabbed a thumb toward the window, toward the dark corral beyond. "You think you're watching a fool out there? You're watching a survivor." And that horse recognized one of his own. No one argued. No one dared. "When he came home," Jack continued, his eyes fixed on some distant, terrible memory, "he came back to that shack, to nights spent waking up in a cold sweat because the fight never really ends. He's been chopping wood and fixing fences, trading his sweat for bread, never asking for a thing." His eyes swept the room again. "You call that weakness. I call it survival. He knows what it's like to be trapped in a storm you can't outrun. And that's why that horse stopped. Because for the first time in its life, it met someone who understood the kind of prison that has no bars." The air in the tavern felt thick, heavy with unspoken truths. At the corner table, Elias finally set down his coffee mug. He lifted his head, and his voice, when it came, was gravelly and low. "Blackstorm's not evil," he said, his grey eyes unflinching. "He's just hurting, same as me. That's all it is." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. For a moment there was only the sound of breathing. Then a whisper started near the bar. Maybe he's right. "No animal's born mean," another man muttered into his beer. The tide had turned. The mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging, confused respect. Clint Morrison wasn't there to see it, but his perfect, cruel spectacle was already starting to unravel. The story was changing. In the quiet of the Iron Spur saloon, a dangerous seed had been planted. Not pity, not laughter, belief. Morning broke over Red Valley with a new energy. The story from the Iron Spur had traveled faster than the sunrise. By 9 o'clock, the whole town was buzzing. The talk wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about the man, about Fallujah, about two survivors meeting in a ring of dust. They drifted back to the arena, drawn by a force they couldn't name. The mood was different today. The bloodlust was gone, replaced by a tense, fragile hope. They were afraid of being disappointed, but more afraid of missing a miracle. When Elias Carter walked into the arena, he wore the same clothes, moved with the same limp. But today the crowd saw him differently. They didn't see a cripple. They saw a soldier. On his platform, Clint Morrison looked less confident. His smile was tight, his eyes restless. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. "Back for more, Carter?" He drawled into the microphone, but his voice lacked its usual swagger. "Some men just don't learn." The gate clanged open, and Blackstorm came out like a nightmare. He screamed, he bucked, he tore at the earth. The rage was still there, a living fire, but after the first wild circuit, he stopped. He planted his hooves and turned to face Elias. He paced a wide circle, head high, ears swiveling. It wasn't a blind rage anymore, it was an evaluation. The animal's eye, still red with adrenaline, was not empty. It was thinking. "Why isn't he charging?" a man blurted out. "Because this is different," a woman answered, her voice full of a certainty that surprised even herself. Elias stood his ground. He lowered his chin just a fraction, a gesture of respect. He didn't stare the horse down. That was a challenge. He just watched. He let a few words drift into the space between them, so soft they were barely sound. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm here." The Mustang snorted, moving sideways, measuring the distance not in feet, but in trust. Elias took a slow step, then another. He moved like a man trying not to wake a sleeping giant. Blackstorm froze, muscles bunched. The crowd held its breath. "You're not alone," Elias said, and the words felt like a prayer. "I know it's hard to believe." The horse's ears flickered. He rocked back, the old instinct, the instinct to destroy, trembling just beneath his skin. Elias stopped, honoring the invisible line the horse had drawn. He held out his open hand. Time stretched thin, the horse's breathing slowed. The fury in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He tipped his head, listening not just to the man, but to something inside himself. "Easy," Elias whispered. "I won't take what you don't give." He closed the last few feet of distance. His hand rose, slow and steady. He let his fingertips find the place where the horse's powerful neck met his mane. The safe place. The honest place. And he touched him. The horse flinched. A full-body tremor, the electric shock of a body that had only ever known pain from a human hand. But he didn't explode. He slammed one hoof into the ground, a single, defiant blow. Dust leaped into the air. Elias kept his hand right where it was, a steady, calming weight. He didn't stroke or pet. He just stayed. A sound broke from the crowd, a raw, involuntary gasp of disbelief and wonder. Elias held his hand there for a count of 4. He felt the tension in the great muscles under his palm begin to ease. He felt the horse's breath deepen. Then, as carefully as he'd placed it, he lifted his hand away. The world stood still for a heartbeat. Then it erupted. The arena shook with a storm of voices, a tidal wave of celebration. Men who had bet on failure whooped until their throats were raw. Women who had prayed for a disaster found themselves crying with joy. "He did it!" Sammy screamed, his voice cutting through the roar. "He touched him." On the platform, Clint Morrison's face went pale. The cigar he was holding snapped between his fingers. "No!" he roared into the microphone, the sound distorted and ugly. "A touch is nothing, a parlor trick. You want the money, you ride him." He jabbed a shaking finger at Elias. "You ride him. 30 seconds on that back, or there's no deal." The cheering died. A wave of outrage rolled through the crowd. "That wasn't the deal," someone shouted. "I say what the deal is," Morrison screeched, his composure gone. "Ride him, or the bet is off." The town held its breath. This was impossible. No one could ride Blackstorm. Elias turned his head and met Morrison's furious gaze with that same infuriating calm. "If you want me to ride him," he said, his voice carrying across the silent arena, "I will, but not today." "Backing out already?" Morrison sneered. "No," Elias replied, his voice like steel. "A horse like this doesn't give you his trust in a single afternoon. You want me on his back? You give me time to earn it." "You've had your time," Morrison blustered, but he could feel the crowd turning on him. 3 days, Elias said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. "Give me 3 days alone with him. I sit with him, I talk to him. I let him know there's one man in this world who won't hurt him. Then I'll ride." Morrison was trapped. He looked at the angry faces in the crowd, the reporters with their cameras pointed at him. He was losing. "Fine," he spat, trying to make it sound like his idea. 3 days, then we end this farce once and for all. Elias gave a single nod. The line had been drawn. As the crowd poured out of the arena, they weren't just talking about a horse anymore. They were talking about a promise. And for the first time in a long time, the people of Red Valley were betting on a man, not a monster. By dawn of the first day, a quiet pilgrimage had formed, a trickle of townsfolk making their way out to the pens behind the arena. They kept their distance, watching from afar. Elias arrived with a sack of apples and a pail of oats. He didn't approach the horse. He just sat on an old bench outside the fence and began to talk. He didn't talk about the war in grand speeches. He talked about the little things, the smell of diesel fuel, the color of the sky over a desert city, the names of men he had laughed with and men he had carried. He talked about waking up with his heart pounding, about the way the walls of his cabin sometimes felt like they were closing in. He said the word lonely and just let it sit there in the air between them. Blackstorm kept his distance, pacing a suspicious circle in the dirt. But he was listening. His ears were a constant compass, tracking the sound of the veteran's low voice. That night, Elias left an apple on the ground just inside the fence before he walked away. The second day, the apple was gone. He slid the pail of oats under the fence, and this time the horse ate. Elias didn't watch him. Only a predator stares at a meal. He talked about Wyoming, about the sound of a river in the spring, the bite of frost on a fence wire. He talked about the things that made this place home, the things that had kept him tethered to the world when everything else was pulling him under. By the afternoon, the horse's breathing had changed. The wild, heaving rhythm was gone, replaced by something slower, more deliberate. On the third day, a small crowd had gathered, their voices low, respectful. Dr. Rachel Hayes, the town vet, stood by the fence, a notebook in her hand. She'd been watching this whole time, her face a mixture of professional skepticism and raw wonder. "I've been working with horses for 15 years, she murmured to Sheriff Walker. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like he's unmaking him, taking apart all the damage someone else did." Just then, Blackstorm took 2 deliberate steps toward Elias. He stretched out his powerful neck, his nostrils flaring, and took the apple directly from the veteran's outstretched hand. He didn't snatch it. He took it gently, his soft lips brushing against Elias's knuckles. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. Rachel's voice was thick with emotion. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows this man won't hurt him. That's the whole damn miracle right there." As the sun began to set on the third day, Elias stood up, working the stiffness from his knee. He looked at the people who had gathered, at the sheriff, at Dr. Hayes. He looked at the horse, who stood quietly, his head level, his posture relaxed. The picture of an animal who had chosen peace over war. He turned toward the arena where the world would be watching tomorrow. "It won't be for the money," he said, to no one and to everyone. "It'll be because he decided I could." That evening, a storm rolled in, a real one, with thunder that shook the windows of the Iron Spur. But inside, the mood was different. That night, an old, grizzled ranch hand named Gus, a man who'd been fired by Morrison years ago, sought out Elias in the quiet of the empty diner. "That scar on the horse's shoulder," Gus began, his voice raspy. "That ain't from no mountain lion." Elias waited. "Morrison did that, with a branding iron. The horse wouldn't break, and Morrison, he lost his temper. I saw it. That's why he fired me, because I saw him turn that animal into a monster." The story got worse. "And that horse," Gus said, leaning closer, "he ain't just some random Mustang. He was the lead stallion of the herd that used to run free up on Whispering Ridge, the land Morrison stole from the Millers after their daddy died. He didn't just take their home, he took their king." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about a bet. This wasn't just about a broken horse. This was about stolen land, a brutalized king, and a rich man who built his empire on the pain of others. The final day dawned bright and clear. The whole world, it seemed, had come to Red Valley. News vans with satellite dishes on top clogged the main street. The stands were packed solid, a sea of faces burning with anticipation. Clint Morrison took his platform, his white hat a beacon of arrogance. But there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. When Elias Carter walked out, a hush fell over the massive crowd. He walked to the center of the ring, moving with that same deliberate pace. The gate opened and Blackstorm thundered out. He was still a force of nature, a vision of raw power. He circled the ring, his hooves pounding a furious rhythm, but he did not charge. Elias just stood there, a quiet island in a sea of tension. He spoke, his voice low and calm. "Easy, big fella. I'm here. No one will hurt you now." The horse wheeled, his red-rimmed eye fixed on the man. He surged forward, then spun away, a test of nerve. Elias didn't flinch. The circle tightened. The world held its breath. Then slowly, deliberately, the great horse lowered his head. It was not submission. It was an invitation, a surrender of his war. A sound, half sob, half cheer, escaped the stands. On the platform, Morrison's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. Elias stepped in. He laid a hand on the horse's neck. He felt the tremor of 1,000 memories run through the powerful body. He swung his good leg over, a slow, careful movement, and settled onto Blackstorm's back. The horse tensed, a lifetime of abuse screaming at him to explode. But he didn't. He stood, trembling, accepting the weight of the man who had offered him not dominance, but understanding. "We're just two survivors," Elias whispered, his voice for the horse alone. "That's all." A stopwatch clicked. The 30 seconds began. The first 10 seconds were an eternity. The horse shifted, testing, his muscles bunched like steel cables. Elias moved with him, a seamless dance of trust. At 20 seconds, Blackstorm tossed his head, a final ghost of his old fury. But it passed. At 30 seconds, the world exploded. The roar from the crowd was deafening, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated joy. Hats flew into the air. Strangers hugged each other, weeping. The chant began, a single word, a single name, thundering from 1,000 throats. "Carter! Carter! Carter!" Elias slid from the horse's back and laid his palm against its neck. Blackstorm stood his ground, letting the man's hand rest there as if it belonged. Then Morrison's voice, shredded with fury, tore through the celebration. "No, the deal is off. That animal is tame. He's been drugged. The bet was for a wild horse. I won't pay a dime." The crowd's joyous roar turned into an ugly snarl. They surged toward the railings, their faces masks of outrage. "You liar!" a woman screamed. "Pay the man!" A chorus of voices bellowed. Sheriff Walker stepped forward, his face grim. "Mr. Morrison, you made the terms. You will honor them." "This wasn't a fair contest," Morrison shrieked. Just then, Dr. Hayes climbed onto the bottom rail, her voice ringing out clear and true. "I examined that horse this morning. There were no drugs, no tricks. The horse chose. That is the entire story." The crowd went wild, their boots stomping on the wooden bleachers, a thunderous rhythm of demand. "Pay him now!" Morrison was trapped. His empire of lies was crumbling around him. Jack Reynolds stepped into the arena, his face set like stone. "Pay the man, Morrison," Jack said, his voice deadly quiet, "or every newspaper in this country will have a front-page story tomorrow about the coward who builds his fortune on bets he won't honor." Morrison's face went white. He knew he was beaten. He snarled at his assistant, who rushed forward with a large leather briefcase. He snapped it open. Inside were stacks and stacks of cash. One by one, he slammed them down on a small table, the sound obscene in the suddenly quiet arena. "Take it," he spat at Elias, his voice dripping with venom. "Take your circus prize, but remember this, Carter. Luck dies, and tomorrow no one will even remember your name." A chorus of boos rained down on him. The crowd wasn't cheering for the money, they were cheering for the man. Elias walked forward. He looked at the mountain of cash. He looked at the ruined, hateful face of Clint Morrison. Then he shook his head. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice clear and strong. A stunned silence fell over the arena. Morrison stared, his mouth hanging open. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the deed to the Miller Ranch, the one Morrison had stolen years ago. Old Gus had kept a copy. "This is what I want," Elias said, holding it up for everyone to see. "This land. You're going to sign it back. To me." The crowd gasped. This was better than money. This was justice. "And that's not all," Elias continued, his voice ringing with authority. The $2 million, it's not mine. It's going into a fund. The Red Valley Fund for Abused Animals and Wounded Veterans. The world erupted. The cheers were bigger, louder than before. This wasn't just a victory, it was a revolution. Trapped by thousands of witnesses and a dozen news cameras, Morrison had no choice. His hand shaking with rage, he signed the deed. The sheriff stamped it, making it official. As Morrison stumbled off his platform in disgrace, a ruined man, Elias turned to the crowd. He didn't smile, he just laid a hand on Blackstorm's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement. He had his king, and now his king had his kingdom back. Morning came soft over Red Valley, but the town was already awake, buzzing with the energy of a place reborn. The story was on every front page, a legend written in ink. Limping vet takes down ranch tyrant. Elias didn't read the papers. He was already at work. The leather briefcase, now holding the signed deed, sat on his table. The $2 million had been wired directly to the new town fund before the sun was even fully up. He didn't use his newfound respect to hold court at the diner. He used it to build. He bought the land, the rolling hills of Whispering Ridge, the place where Blackstorm was born. And with the help of the whole town, he started to build a sanctuary. Jack Reynolds showed up with a post-hole digger. Dr. Hayes brought her entire medical kit and a team of volunteers. Even the young cowboys who had once mocked him came, hammers in hand, their faces sheepish but determined. They built fences, raised a barn, and dug a new well. They hung a simple, hand-painted sign at the entrance. Sanctuary Plains. A second chance for the ones they called monsters. The day the gates opened, Blackstorm walked onto his ancestral land. He paused, lifting his head, tasting the wind. Then he let out a call, not of rage, but of homecoming. He broke into a canter, then a gallop, a black flag of freedom against the green hills. The townspeople who had gathered to watch wept without shame. The sanctuary grew, other horses came, rescued from abuse and neglect. And veterans came too. Men and women with invisible scars found a strange peace in the quiet work of the sanctuary, mending fences and mending themselves. The Carter Fund, managed by Sheriff Walker and Dr. Hayes, provided them with support, with therapy, with a bridge back to the world. Red Valley changed. The tourists who came now weren't looking for a spectacle of violence. They came to see the place where a quiet man had proved that understanding was stronger than force. They came to see the legendary Blackstorm who now grazed peacefully, the undisputed gentle king of his herd. Years passed. The story became a legend, a part of the fabric of Wyoming. Elias grew older, his limp more pronounced, but his eyes never lost their steady calm. He would sit by the fence for hours, just watching the horses, a quiet patriarch content in his kingdom. One evening, as the sun set fire to the western sky, a young boy, not much older than Sammy had been, approached him at the fence. "Were you scared?" the boy asked, his eyes wide. "When he charged you?" Elias looked at Blackstorm, who was now flecked with grey around his muzzle, his great body softened by age. "No," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "I wasn't scared of him. I was scared for him. There's a difference." He turned back to the boy. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit," he said, his gaze as clear as the Wyoming sky. "It's about how much you can understand. Remember that." The legend of Elias Carter and Blackstorm wasn't just a story about a man and a horse. It was a story about a town that learned to be better. A story that proved that the deepest wounds can be healed, not with power, but with patience. It was a testament to the fact that even in the dust and the noise, a quiet voice, speaking a language of shared pain, can change the world. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content.